Robert Fordham, the Executive Director of the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning, and my colleague, Dean Marcelo Camperi of the College of Arts and Sciences, for their support. I also want to offer a special thanks to the Fromm Institute staff for all their help with logistics. I am now pleased to introduce Mr. Robert Fordham.
Good evening, everyone. I appreciate the welcome. Thank you, Dr. Cannon. Ladies and gentlemen, we are duly honored by the presence of Joyce Carol Oates and Michael Krasny this evening, and we thank you for being with us. A round of applause for them, please. And we are tremendously delighted that the Fromm Institute can be a part of this evening as we celebrate our 35th year at University of San Francisco. It is truly wonderful to be a part of this and all that we participate in here at the university campus. I personally want to thank the members of the USF Board of Trustees who've chosen to join us this evening. Ms. McGrath, thank you for being with us. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention the dedicated men and women who serve on the Friends of the Fromm Institute Board of Directors. I want to thank them for joining us as well. I have a colleague in arms who's my right and left hand. That's Professor Al Johnson. Al, thank you for all your work for the Fromm Institute, and thank you for being with us. And I have a special thank you I have to extend. Ladies and gentlemen, the evening would not have happened without the help of Caroline Fromm-Laurie. Caroline, thank you for your work. Ms. Oates, the students of the University of San Francisco are anxious tonight to listen to your words. Among them are a unique subset of students. They're the students of the Fromm Institute who believe and practice this belief that lifelong learning is a vital part of healthy aging. And to the Frommies who've joined us this evening, I salute you all. I'd now like to reintroduce Dr. Cannon. Dr. Cannon?
Thank you, Robert. He's a hard act to follow. The planning for this program really began about 15 years ago, believe it or not, when Randy Souther, who is interim head of reference and research services at the library, who was then my reference technology librarian, taught himself to make a web page by creating his own personal web page for Joyce Carol Oates. It has since grown to become Joyce Carol Oates' de facto official website. Since that time, 15 years ago, Randy and I often discuss how we would be able to bring Ms. Oates to campus. I am pleased to say that it has finally happened. Please welcome Randy, who will introduce Mr. Krasny and Ms. Oates. Randy.
Thanks, Tyrone. So I just want to thank Michael Krasny again for agreeing to be our interviewer this evening. His presence makes a very special evening for us, even more so. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Michael Krasny as the host of KQED's award-winning Forum, a news and public affairs program that concentrates on the arts, culture, health, business, and technology. Forum is one of KQED's most popular shows and the nation's most listened to, locally produced public radio talk show. Since 1970, Michael has been a professor of English at San Francisco State University and has taught at Stanford and at UCSF. He's the author of Off Mic, a memoir of talk radio and literary life, and most recently of Spiritual Envy, An Agnostic's Quest. He's a widely published scholar and literary critic, a fiction writer, and a guest and frequent interviewer on the City Arts and Lectures stage. Please welcome to the stage Michael Krasny. When Joyce Carol Oates introduced Stephen King to a Princeton audience in 1997, she noted that it's commonly said that certain people need no introductions, but that on the contrary, it's precisely those whom we imagine we know in broadly stereotypical terms who require introductions. And that, I think, is the case here. Joyce Carol Oates is prolific. She has published more than 150 books. Okay. That is the broad, stereotypical way that many people know her. Every book review of one of her books begins with some variation on that statistic. But there are some different statistics that might put the 150 in a different light. Every year in December, the New York Times puts out a list of their notable books of the year. From 1963 to the present, 40 of Joyce Carol Oates' books have appeared on those lists. Now, the notable books list is not exactly an award, but in the case of Joyce Carol Oates, it does seem to be an indicator of the consistently high quality of her work. Also reflecting this are the award anthologies, such as the Best American Short Stories or the O. Henry Prize Stories series. 29 of Joyce Carol Oates' stories have appeared in the O. Henry anthologies. That's more than any writer in the 100-year history of the O. Henry stories. The next most frequently appearing writers are Alice Adams, John Updike, and William Faulkner. In the Best American Short Stories series, which also has been around for almost a century, Joyce Carol Oates is not the most frequently appearing author. That distinction goes to the great Canadian short story writer Alice Munro with 18 stories. Joyce currently has 17. Although I'm told that Joyce's 18th story will appear in the 2011 edition. So these are remarkable numbers, plus the fact that her works have also been included in the Best American Essays, the Best American Mystery Stories, the Best American Poetry, the Best American Short Plays, the year's Best Fantasy and Horror, and the Pushcart Prize. Now, what do the scholars and critics think about these 150 books? Here's 4 of them and what they've had to say. Henry Louis Gates, Jr., the Harvard critic and scholar. Joyce Carol Oates has become one of the elemental forces of American fiction, and yet to the museum keepers of national culture, her skill at resisting critical containment must be unnerving. She picks up and discards generic forms at will. She refuses to restrict herself to one subject, to one stratum of society, one personality type. Indeed, her very productivity stands as a reproach. What's curious is that Oates writes as if each novel is her first, last, and only one, a singular testament to her existence. A future archaeologist, equipped only with her oeuvre, could easily piece together the whole of post-war America. John Updike, who knew a thing or two about being a prolific writer, had this to say. Joyce Carol Oates was perhaps born 100 years too late. She needs a lustier audience, a race of Victorian word eaters, to be worthy of her astounding productivity. She has, I fear, rather overwhelmed the puny, parsimonious, critical establishment of this country. Single-mindedness and efficiency, rather than haste, underlie her prolificacy. If the phrase woman of letters existed, she would be, foremost in this country, entitled to it. A UK scholar, Gavin Cologne Brooks, who published a recent monograph on Joyce Carol Oates' novels, says, Oates' achievements are indisputable for anyone who has read her work extensively. Her body of novels, let alone her work in other genres, is among the most wide-ranging in contemporary writing. She is the nearest America could currently have to a national novelist. And last, the late great critic John Leonard said, "It's as if this prodigious novelist can't help registering all the voices the culture tries to repress. She hears screams and writes books. I am reminded of Joan of Arc, who heard bells and then immediately had visions. After the rapture of carillons, see Catherine or Margaret or Michael. Oates, too, consorts with warrior angels." Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to USF our national novelist, Joyce Carol Oates.
Let me just say, by way of introduction, and thank you all for being here and for that lovely welcome. I have to say, by way of introduction, that Joyce and I are kind of like dancing partners. I mean, we've done a number of interviews through the years, both on stage and on the air, and I feel indebted to her for not only enhancing my life with her work, but also actually for enhancing my own work, because she wrote the foreword to my book, Spiritual Envy, for which I'm really quite grateful. That sounds a little bit incestuous, but believe me, it's not. Even though there was a point when I said to her, we're both kind of working class kids who used to like running with the wild types and all that, and maybe we're a little bit sibling-like here, and I even mentioned that fact in my book Off Mic. But I'm delighted to be here with her, and I'm delighted to lead a conversation, and hope that at about really when we've reached the hour mark, you will be willing and eager to join in and ask any questions that you might have, or simply join us in conversation. And I want to begin by talking about the new book, because the new book, the most recent book, I should say, is a book about the loss of her husband. And many of you already know the story. She was married to Raymond Smith, who was the editor of the Ontario Review, who was a beloved husband for decades. It was a very fulfilling and rich and abundant marriage, and he died. And this is the story, really, of his death, but it's a deeper story of her grieving and of her really reaching into levels of self with respect to suffering and pain that she had never written about before. I want to recommend the book to any of you who haven't read it. It's very poignant, and it's really quite extraordinary. And I want to say also before we begin that there is a happy ending. Joyce is presently remarried, and her husband is here today. Charlie Gross, who is a neuroscientist who's on leave from Princeton at Berkeley. Charlie, just acknowledging you over there. I wanted to begin then by talking about what you write about in The Widow's Story. And it's so painful to read because of the pain you were going through, that what I thought of initially we could talk about is that sense of how so often you've gone into other lives with the empathy of a novelist and a fiction writer, and you've got this handle for many years, the Dark Lady of American literature, but you've seen things that many people need to see or haven't even imagined seeing. And here you were looking within. And you're writing always psychologically, but you're suddenly writing about yourself psychologically. How different is that? Let's just begin there. I mean, in many ways it seems to me you're almost in a different universe, aren't you?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think that as a writer, I've always been drawn to dramatic scenes, and I feel a kinship. I'm not confusing myself with Shakespeare, but I feel a kinship with Shakespeare, who looked upon life, obviously, as a sequence of powerfully dramatic scenes that build, and there's a sort of a climax. And as with lightning crashing in the sky, there's a kind of enlightenment or illumination of dark places. And I think that through the focusing on the dramatic, unpredictable dramatic experience that I was writing about myself, that I had for the first time, I seemed to have unpredictable experiences that were like these fissures in the clouds where the lightning is shining through. And I had never really had those experiences before, but I'd written about them and other people. And I felt a kinship, oddly, with the voice of the persona of Edgar Allan Poe in some of his shorter pieces like The Telltale Heart, where there's an isolated first-person narrator who's sort of completely isolated and all alone in some strange world that he's seeking to comprehend. And I think now that Poe basically is writing about himself. And he's writing about himself in these stark existential positions. So when I couldn't write fiction for quite a while, I was able to write in my journal. It's sort of, I'm making gestures because I write on strips of paper in longhand. And I would lie in bed at night in a little nest that I made out with books and my mother's quilt and sometimes a cat. If I was really lucky, a cat would be with me. And I was sort of writing down what happened that day and different things that I had thought. But it wasn't fiction, and I didn't have that capacity to create fictional worlds because I was in this raw and unmediated world. So it was both different from what I'd done before, but in some ways similar.
Mm-hmm. Do you have to detach, though, in some ways when you go into that kind of writing, or is it just the opposite? Is it you're so, in a sense, inflicted by what you're going through that you can't detach?
Well, I think I would recommend journal keeping for anyone, not just people in crisis, but most obviously keeping a journal, in fact, when you're very exhausted or you've been at a hospital or you have a close call, you're ill, or something's extreme in your life. Keeping a journal is very powerful because it ties you to your own past, which may melt away. I mean, nothing disappears so quickly as scenes of crisis. They come and they disappear because they're so intense. And so I would recommend that for people who are in a position that's somewhat precarious. But I'd also recommend it just for ordinary life.
But when you turn this into a book, the reason I asked about detachment is you write about sort of your public self and your private self, and you also write about the widow. And the widow becomes a protagonist, name the widow. So there's a kind of distancing, at least that needs to be done, even
That's
though
right.
you're going through all this suffering.
Well, we should always remember that any work of art, like a book, is a product that took some time. And when we look at a book, say by James Joyce's Ulysses, which is like, 700 pages long, it took 7 years to write, you can't encompass all the process that went into it. It's misleading, So when I was writing in my journal, I had no idea that I'd write a memoir. I had no idea that I would be alive the next week or the next day. I was completely focused on this existential crisis, the way a person would be walking on a tightrope across an abyss, where you're just sort of looking at each footstep that you're doing is all you can contend with. So after a long time, I mean months, I was still writing in the journal this way. And I was also printing out emails because I extended my journal writing to emails that I wrote to people. Some of the people became friends of mine. Some of them were people I have never met, but they were friends of Ray's, or they were connected with the magazine, or they were writers, or somebody like the printer in northern Michigan. I still have a relationship with him, but email, I've never met him. So I printed these out because to me they were all part of the spiritual experience. And these emails were very intense and very real. They weren't about frivolous and silly things, but they were about deeper things. So they were part of my journal. And so in the summer of 2009, when I was having trouble creating a novel, which is a fictitious structure, I turned back to this material, probably 500 pages of it, and then I went back to it and reread it, and I thought it was very powerful and very emotional, and I thought I would put it into a memoir by restructuring it and editing it, and certainly I edited a lot out. And then I added what you call the widow's character. The widow is like a universal character, not necessarily me, who appears in footnotes that are italicized. Like in a typical little chapter, I'm driving my husband to the hospital, and it seemed like the correct thing to do, and we're anxious and excited, and we think, oh, he might be there overnight. That was the fear was that he'd be overnight instead of just a couple of hours. But he never came back. And so there's a footnote that says the widow-to-be has no idea she's taking her husband, thinking that she's doing the right thing. She's taking her husband to the very place that will ensure his doom, because then he contracted a hospital infection that, I mean, possibly would not have happened at another time, in another hospital. So I wanted to have that sort of multiple layer of time where one is the raw first person historical present where I say, I am doing this, and I think it's the right thing, and Ray's next to me. But then having the italicized footnote from the future, looking down upon it as just a fait accompli, and maybe it seemed like the right thing to do, but maybe it was the complete wrong thing to do.
Well, that perch of time gives you the advantage that really leads you, for example, to recognize the irony early on in the book about almost getting into an accident where you thought you were both going to die.
The irony.
Yeah.
The irony. Yes, almost all of it's ironic, except in one section when I read about the garden, I blunder into taking over my husband's garden. He was a gardener, and I was never a gardener. And then that was just like I thought it was a mistake. I would have to do the garden or let it go to weeds. And I felt so bad about letting his beautiful garden go to weeds that I went out and I did all these things that gardeners do, and I went to the nursery and brought plants back. I thought going out once I'd bring plants back and that would be it, you know. And I ended up going like 25 times, like a person addicted to the slot machines or something. But then I noticed that this was something I didn't expect to do, so I was a footnote saying, by accident, the widow has hit upon the one thing that will save her, and that's the garden. But she doesn't really know what she's doing. Some things are blunders, but they turn out well.
You mentioned James Joyce before. It's a little like a story probably many people know, one of the most famous stories in Dubliners, where he's the boy and he's going through the experience, and at the same time he's in the perch of time looking back, and
Araby?
both working simultaneously. Yeah.
Is that Araby?
Araby, yeah.
Yeah. I looked up and saw myself as a creature driven by vanity. Mm-hmm. That I have that thought right from Joyce's Araby often. I'm walking along somewhere. It says, I saw myself as a creature driven by vanity. There's a line, every story has a beautiful final line just about, and that's my favorite line, and I use it all the time. It's sort of, maybe it's scrolling underneath the stage, and as you look up here and say, creatures of vanity, you know.
Literary lines come to you and are an important part of your life? Were they during this experience?
Oh, yes, it's sort of a scroll. It's always going through my head. And songs and ballads and poems. Yeah. The ending of King Lear becomes very powerful when you've lost someone. But King Lear, or Lear, is raging out on the heath, and he says all these things that are so profound that previously in his life he would not have comprehended. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of the play, when Cordelia has been strangled, he thinks these powerful lines again. He says, all these creatures have life, like flies and rats and so forth, but Cordelia has lost her life. And that's so poignant, and that's something that you don't think about except at that time. But Shakespeare had this wonderful intuitive grasp of how people are in these dramas. As I said a few minutes ago, he's a great dramatist. He sees the human adventure is a dramatic adventure.
The thing that's always moved me so much about Lear, and it does dovetail in some ways with my reading of The Widow's Story, is the sense of Shakespeare's unrelenting feeling of nothingness. Nothing will mean more than nothing from the beginning when Lear's dividing up his kingdom, right through when Cordelia dies and he's holding her.
Nothing will come of nothing.
Carrying her in his arms. There's that sense. And you were, in this book, it seems to me, you talk about tightrope, walking a tightrope. I mean, you were on the verge of falling into a nothingness, falling into a sense of, I don't want to wake up the next morning. There's no point in even going on. And counting pills and thinking of suicide in a constant manner. And so many of the lessons that are so valuable in reading this book is you just have to do the kind of quotidian things that make up your life, whether it's teaching, whether it's your friendship, whether it's, the onerous things that come upon you when you're a widow that you have to do to just get on and survive.
Well, since the book was published, a number of people have spoken to me, particularly widows, and they found things that resonated with them. And one of the things that they definitely felt was that it's so necessary to get out of the house. Being in the house is a place of meditation and grieving and mourning, and that is good in its way. But then it's also a place of deterioration and stasis. And then you have to get out of the house, and you have to go out, even though you don't want to. You don't want to get out of bed, but you get out of bed and you get dressed, and you go out. And if you have a job, that's wonderful. And then my job and my teaching at Princeton University was very important. I threw myself into that spring term. I really, really had wonderful students, and there was an intensity and mystical attachment to some of those students that I'm embarrassed to say I don't have all the time. It was something that was just sort of focusing on them, and I would get very tearful. Like a girl came in, she had rewritten something that we'd critiqued a couple weeks before, and she had a revision. And I was actually tearful because it was so good. And I thought, this is so wonderful, the students are learning something. And I was kind of, not exactly hysterical, but it was a kind of overwrought identification with the teaching. But if I hadn't had that, and some people said to me, oh, Joyce, you should take the whole spring term off and not teach, Or you should cancel all your lectures and readings, and that would have been a terrible mistake. So that's one of the things I did put in the memoir, that I wanted to have a handbook, that there's some things where you can make a wrong decision, thinking that maybe you can't do something, but you can do it.
I was struck also at one point in the narrative when you don't think that your students know that you've lost your husband, and then you find out that indeed they do.
Yes, I didn't think the students knew, because we love our students, but they seem a little self-absorbed, adolescents. And they're very caught up in their own little lives. And but then they basically did, because I looked up, I was in my office, and two students were standing in the doorway, kind of embarrassed. And they said, Professor Oates is what they call us at Princeton, Professor Oates, if there's anything we can do, and they really meant it. They were looking so yearning and so stricken. And it came over me, and I thought, well, they must have known all along, and they've been talking about it amongst themselves. And then one class sent me a little sympathy card, and they all signed it, and that was very sweet.
And there were little things. What keeps coming back to my mind is that earring. Can you talk about that?
Finding the earring?
Yeah.
Well, I lost a lot of things, and many of them I never found again. When you've had a trauma, you don't remember where you put your car keys. You don't remember lots of things. It's amazing. I had a sequence of surprises of how unable I was to control my memory and so forth. But I did lose things. But then if I found things again, like I found an earring in the trash, I found that was like grace, since we're in the spiritual university here. The theological idea of grace has a kind of psychological component, I think. Grace is defined as that which you don't deserve, which sort of comes to you and illuminates you, and it makes you understand how dependent you are on some force outside you. And that had to happen to me many times. So I think becoming a widow allowed me to know how dependent I am on other forces and on other people. It's as if I'd been in a canoe paddling. Not that I do that often, but you're sort of paddling along, and you erroneously think that you're paddling, but actually somebody else is really paddling, and somebody else is really controlling a canoe. And what you're doing is this sort of feeble thing, but you're vain. And you think that what your feeble paddling is it, but it actually wasn't. So I kept learning that. That happened a lot.
You had to become really much more self-reliant, in the old Emersonian sense of self-reliance, didn't you?
Well, I was self-reliant in one sense, but then I was aware that I wasn't very capable. I wasn't very capable of many things. I think was interesting too, I looked upon writing the memoir as an investigation of a universal state rather than just my own. But what was interesting to me, especially in retrospect, at the time it was not very, very pleasant, the distortions in memory and distortions in perception. I definitely had distortions of perception. For instance, right after Ray died, I had to look for his will. Now, we all know that this must happen. A loved one dies and you look for the will, and I knew where to look, but I couldn't find the will because I was looking for a large, like a medieval manuscript or a scroll or something. I was literally looking for a large object, and I couldn't find it. And then when I finally found it, it was just like the size, like a legal stationery or something. It was smaller. And that was really startling to me. I still remember looking for a large object, and what really was there was just this ordinary size.
It was pretty amazing and dramatic in many ways to read his novel, too, wasn't it?
Yes, and Ray had been a writer. Long before I met him, he'd been a writer. He became a professor, and he got his PhD in 18th century English studies at the University of Wisconsin, which is where we met. I should say for people who don't know this, that when I took Ray to the hospital, he had a high fever and couldn't breathe very well, and we knew something was wrong with him. As I said, we thought he might be in the hospital like a few hours, and then he had to stay overnight, and we felt so surprised. Then he was diagnosed with pneumonia. We were completely surprised. And all along the line with this surprise, everything seemed surprising. Then in retrospect, looking at it, it didn't seem that anything really was that surprising, that people have these experiences all the time, including death. But everywhere along the line, we were completely surprised. And so he was getting better in the hospital, being treated for pneumonia, and then he contracted a hospital infection. And within a few hours, that got in his bloodstream, and he just died. And so it was so stunning. And this is like the background to writing the memoir. If he had had a long time illness, and I had been able to comprehend that and look into the future, there wouldn't have been that shock. It may have been that I wouldn't have written the memoir, I'm not sure, but it was this era of surprises and drama. Then one of the things that I found after he died, I looked through his desk because I had to do a lot of legal things, and the final issue of the magazine had to be put together and completed. I did that. I'd be at his desk like 2 o'clock in the morning, making out checks to the printer and doing all the things that Ray would have done. That also kept me going. It was exhausting, but it kept me going. It was a positive thing in that way.
Because of his dedication to the
yeah. I would never have just let it go. I was talking on the phone to the printer and the typesetter and doing all the things that Ray would have done. I sort of took over the things that he would have done. And that was a positive thing, though at the time it was exhausting. But then one of the things I found, though I knew it was there, I hadn't seen it in a long time, was a manuscript, an incomplete manuscript of a novel that he'd been working on when he was quite young, before we had met. And then I knew he had it, but then he gave it up, and it was, actually has Jesuits in it. And partly set at a Jesuit university in Milwaukee, which is Marquette University. And Ray had at one point in his life been in the seminary when he was 18. It was a long time ago. And the novel's about a priest who is sort of like my husband. And it was a very interesting and disturbing novel for me to read. And it had a lot of things crossed out, and it was written on manual typewriter, and lots of notes. And it was so touching to see a young man's novel and to know that my husband had been working on it, and it wasn't finished. It was sort of Joycean. Most people, Jesuits and people who were writing novels about crisis and faith, would look to James Joyce as a sort of mentor. So first I couldn't read it. I was afraid to read it. I read a little bit, then I put it aside. And then finally I did read it.
And saw a side of him in many respects that you didn't know. Or
Well,
learn more about him that you didn't know?
Yeah, I
certainly,
learned
yeah.
more, and then he had always told me that he never wrote on it after we met, but then I discovered things in it that were definitely conversations that we'd had, and that was sort of stunning because there's a young woman in the novel who's sort of like me, and it was, wow, it was like looking in a mirror, I mean, a distorting mirror or something, and that was, it could have had a tragic ending, but it didn't, I was afraid to look at it.
Could you have written this story, what you went through, could you have turned that into a novel?
What I went through,
What you went through, what you wrote about in your memoir? Yeah.
I tried to write a novel, but because the reality was so haunting and vivid, I couldn't make it into fiction because the fiction enhances things, but when you have the reality so vivid, you wouldn't then write a novel. It's like Michael Herr when he went to Vietnam. Michael Herr was my classmate at Syracuse. I'm sure that Michael Herr wanted to be the great American novelist, but when he went to Vietnam, he wrote nonfiction. It was called Dispatches. It's like considered the greatest book of the Vietnam War. I think probably Michael felt that, wow, this reality is so profound, I'm not going to write a novel. I'm just going to write about reality, and it's a very great work of nonfiction.
When we heard those wonderful tributes and laudatory remarks from those four sources that Randy read, somebody called you the great American novelist, and I wonder what that whole notion of the great American novel means to Joyce Carol Oates. I think it was Norman Mailer who said, well, there's only been one great American novel, and that was John Dos Passos, and that's the trilogy because of its expansiveness. I mean, is there a great American novel? Have you conceived of what that actually means, or is that just a chimera sort of?
Well, Michael, I think that's an interesting question. That's a sort of question that probably evolves in literature courses. I'm not sure that it has relevance outside an academics context. I feel that America's too large. It's too large, it's various, there are too many different, now especially, so many different ethnic groups. And there are literally different languages and different dialects, different regions. At one point when we had a very small America, I mean relatively small, when it was mostly like New England, and a bit of the South, you could argue that Moby Dick was a great American novel, but it has no women in it, and it's set out at sea, and it's about a big fish, a big mammal, let's say. So I would argue if I went on a tour to China, I would probably talk about Moby Dick as the quintessential great American novel, even though it is set at sea and there are no women in it, because it has all these different races, the different races of the crew of the Pequod, and Melville was particularly trying to write about America with all the different ethnic types, and with a madman, but a very noble Shakespearean kind of alpha male at the head of it. And the ship, the Pequod, is a microcosm of capitalism. There are all these different things that you could point to that is a or the great American novel, but there's so much that's not in it, But you wouldn't argue that The Sound and the Fury is the great American novel because it's so site-specific to the American South, and you wouldn't argue that Edith Wharton is the great American novel because it's site-specific to New York City. John Dos Passos did try to encompass all of America and using the headlines, and he had a trilogy of novels. And that may be the closest, but people don't read John Dos Passos anymore. I don't know why.
No, I was thinking about a writer like Thomas Wolfe, who people don't read anymore either, but he was very
That
localized
breadth, yeah,
regionally to North Carolina and the South, but wanted to produce, I suppose, what became sort of the seminal notion of the great American novel. When I think of your work, I think of them as falling into that kind of, and it is, of course, regional. The setting is very important, but it has that
right.
kind of
Yeah.
breadth to it and epic quality to it.
Well, I had never lived in a big city before. I lived in Detroit, Michigan. And then when I wrote them, it was after the so-called Detroit riots of 1967. So I was looking consciously at race and the economy and politics, and I was able to do this in a very conscious way that one could not do writing in the country. I had written novels set in the country before. That somehow it's an accident of where you are when you're writing about something. Like the great French novels would be Parisian, and there would be Balzac, because he's right in the center of all the things that are going on. And if you're writing, it's 18th century, 19th century England, and you're in London, that's where the great novel would be, probably. You know, some of these things are accidental. But I think now, in the 21st century, there can never again be a great American novel, because we're so diverse, culturally very diverse.
But if you look at the canon of your work, you do have rural set works, especially up in upper state New York. You have the inner city. You have the suburbs like Bloomfield Hills. I mean, you pretty much cover the territory and go through that kind of range that captures a lot of what America is.
That's true, but I'm a white girl. And I'm from a certain culture. You know, I can't speak for a person who's an immigrant. My grandparents were immigrants, but there's a lot of things that I can't do that other writers can do, and they do very easily and very brilliantly. Like my colleague Toni Morrison writes from a certain perspective of the black experience, and she's not an immigrant, but it's the sort of immigrant experience that you have when you're at the periphery of the society and you're over here looking in. And Jubur Lahiri writes so beautifully about that. And many of my colleagues and my contemporaries who are, if not immigrants, the sons and daughters of immigrants, they stand at the periphery and they see a lot of things that you don't see when you're white. When you're in the majority, you're sort of somewhat blinded, I think.
I'm sorry, I'm smiling because I'm remembering a conversation that Toni Morrison had with Bill Moyers when he said to Toni Morrison, when are you going to come more into the center? Meaning, when are you going to write about, you know, like Tolstoy, about all kinds of different ethnicities and different lives and the whole capacious sense of the world? And she said, Mr. Moyers, you have to come into the center where I am. Which is
I can't believe he would ask a question like that. That is so condescending.
It was a serious faux pas, and he realized
It's so
it, I think.
condescending. I know people would say to Tony and other black writers, well, when you get over this race stuff, you know, you write a real novel.
There was that attitude, though, for many years among American literary critics that, you know, you really, if you were black, you were writing about parochial experiences
That's right.
that were much too, and even among Jewish writers and Southern writers until they began to be seen as more universal.
Well, let's talk about that, since you probably know a lot about Jewish writers. Saul Bellow comes along with Augie March, and he just sort of devastated and revolutionized what might have been called the Jewish American novel or literature. And he sort of comes along like a locomotive, you know. I'm an American, Chicago born, but Augie March says, I'm an American. And that was a bold statement, because before that, the Jewish American literature had been it's sort of parochial, I mean, brilliant, and the sort of thing that Bernard Malamud did, for instance. It was very wonderful, but much more parochial. Whereas Bellow had this audacity to write about intellectual subjects, political subjects, cultural, things that we call the zeitgeist, which is sort of a cliche. But Bellow just sort of waded right in, you know, with his great enthusiasm and energy. And almost wouldn't matter where Saul Bellow was. He happened to be in Chicago or in New York. But with that vision, he could basically have been anywhere. So he was writing the great American novel.
It was that vernacular voice, though, that really revolutionized
That's right.
American literature. Augie March was 1954, and suddenly you had Yinglish, as people called it, but it was also
Yes.
the erudition that Bellow had, along with the street smarts and the street voice. Yeah,
Everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's somebody who has that vision and the voice and the audacity to say, well, I'm going to write about all these different things. Whereas poor Bernard Malamud is still always writing about the Jew as victim, wherever a pogrom or victim of working in a pawn shop or something. That one is the vision of the Jew, or say the black person, as a victim, and the other is more of a vision where they're going to go out with their almost entrepreneurial attitude and say, well, I'm just going to wade in here and write this great novel.
I was thinking also about something Richard Wright once said. He said, the Negro, they used to call them that, the Negro is America's metaphor. And I think he was getting at something really substantial that you've done. I think of them, and I think of many of your short stories, where you may be writing as the outsider, the white writer, but at the same time you're getting at something that's quintessentially American in the black experience.
Well, I think I'm very sympathetic and identify with black people, and I've written a number of novels, and I feel a kind of thrill and exuberance and excitement. Like in Black Girl, White Girl, it's very much a novel about a white girl being infatuated with a black girl. And as the writer, I was sort of outside both of them. I could see the white girl exhibits liberal guilt. She's the daughter of well-to-do people who were once, generations back, Quakers, and they founded a college. The black girl is very Christian, and she's sort of conservative, evangelical Christian. The white girl is an agnostic, very liberal politically, and just sort of the clash of the two. And I felt really more sympathy for the black girl. I don't know, I just saw the drama between the two just very irresistible and very interesting. And I didn't feel that it was any stretch, or that I was being a ventriloquist, or that I was doing something I shouldn't be doing. And what was so nice about Henry Louis Gates and that wonderful quote that Randy Souther read, Henry Louis Gates, of course, is one of the very great black scholars, that he never felt in writing about my writing that I shouldn't have been doing it. You know, some people say you're not supposed to write about anything except your own experience, but other people say you should write about anything anyone with whom you feel sympathy and identity.
You remember that whole flap when William Styron wrote the
Yes.
Confessions of Nat Turner? I mean,
Yes.
now I don't think there would be anything like that would take place to that degree or that intensity. There was a lot of anger because Styron, a Southern white writer, had assumed the voice of Nat Turner, who led a slave rebellion.
Well, I think the problem with it wasn't the concept, it was execution. They didn't like, there are quotes that, well, I don't want to be critical of Bill Styron because he was a friend of mine, but some people thought that he was a racist, and the words he was putting in Nat Turner's mouth were not authentic or plausible for a black person. And the way that he was looking at white women seemed like a lurid, hallucinatory fantasy that some white man had made up. I mean, that was the problem, I think, that people thought it wasn't executed with respect. And
I read some of Styron's daughter's memoir about her life with her father. And
I did too.
Well, what I was struck with, I want to bring it back to the widow story, because what I was struck by, and then I want to ask you about your own writing about an encounter you had, which was somewhat tense, with a black woman in the hospital when you brought Ray in later on. But just Styron was, according to his daughter's descriptions, a pretty difficult man, to put it mildly.
Difficult.
Yeah, but of course he went through this terrible depression, and he had tremendous empathy for people who were suffering with depression. Now, what I'm wondering is, what has this experience done for you? I mean, there's not much you said that grief can really provide, but in the way of understanding human beings to a deeper level, especially with things like depression and suicidal impulses, has it given you that?
Oh, yes, I think so. I became extremely sympathetic with people who self-medicate, or people who are alcoholics or take drugs. I always felt before that a kind of prim or puritanical slight judgment, that, oh, they're weak, or they could take care of themselves better, or they're just drinking because they want to. But I really felt that life is so painful, especially at certain times, like at 2 o'clock in the morning when you can't sleep, and you just say, well, I don't really care, I'm just going to take this medication or whatever. And I felt that I understood Marilyn Monroe better. I'd written a novel about Marilyn Monroe, who couldn't sleep without barbiturates, and finally she took too many. And I just feel that like 4 a.m. of an exhausting night, she fumbled and reached for some medication, and she said, oh, I don't care, I'm just going to take 5 of them, And I understand that, and I don't think I probably quite understood that before.
You once told me, after you wrote Marilyn, that you identified her and your mother in a number of ways.
Well, the photograph of Norma Jean Baker when she was about 16 reminded me of my mother. She was a very pretty girl, a high school age girl with brown hair and a little flower thing, like a little hat on her head. And she wasn't glamorous, and she didn't look like Marilyn Monroe, but she was cute. And when I saw that photograph, that's why I wanted to write the novel, because she's an ordinary American girl, and then a few years later, she's going to be this Andy Warhol, mass-produced, grotesque vulgarity, and his silkscreen Marilyn Monroe. And I wanted to see how does a young American girl get from being this pretty, innocent high school girl to this grotesque male fantasy that Andy Warhol had created. That was why I wrote the novel.
You want to talk about that encounter with the black woman? Because it's a very revealing one in terms of all that you went through with it. Comes fairly early on in A Widow's Story.
Well, it's not that she was black at all. I don't think that's relevant. It was this feeling that you get in a hospital that you're so much at the mercy of hospital attendants. I mean, she could have been any different nationality, or she could have been a man. It's just that we found ourselves in a hospital room, and the nurse's aide, I thought, was demented. And I was kind of scared. So I had to leave my husband there. And she seemed demented, or something was wrong with her. Maybe she was on pills or whatever. She just wouldn't stop chattering. She was just hysterically chattering, and my husband needed to sleep, and I was exhausted. We couldn't stop her talking. I think the fact that she was black is actually irrelevant.
Well, you mentioned the audacity of Sal Bello in Chicago. You liked Obama. How do you feel about Obama now?
Well, Obama is so much better than his predecessors. I'm not going to be critical of Obama. I just met him for the first time about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and he gave me the National Humanities Medal. And
Congratulations, by the way.
he's my friend for life. No, first of all, the medal winners, among them were Philip Roth and Donald Hall, the poet, and Gordon Wood, the wonderful historian, and a number of other people. Arnold Rampersad, who's from at Stanford University. Anyway, we're in this room in the White House, in the East Wing, and waiting for the ceremony. And we heard this voice saying, well, this is a fancy group. And we looked around, and there was President Obama. And he wasn't expected. He just sort of came in, and he had a nice smile, and he was shaking hands. He'd say to Philip Roth, oh, I love Portnoy, and Gordon Wood, I love your historical books. And he had a little thing for everybody that he said. And then he said, for me, I'm a real fan. And what does that mean? One doesn't ask. Never ask. Then I met Michelle. She says, I'm a real fan. And again, I'm not going to ask. But then when he gave me the medal, and it's sort of a medal, it's on a ribbon put over your head, he said to me, I bought your new book, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. And that's what people often say, you know. And I said to him, I couldn't think of anything else to say. This is my feeble rejoinder was, I said, well, you've been pretty busy.
I thought you were going to ask him if he bought it in an independent bookstore.
I should have asked him that. But he's really great, and they're both very tall. I felt I was like on a basketball team, but the other team, and this is the real team, the champion, that like they're this tall, and I'm kind of defense in the other team.
Well, you've become one of our literary lions, and yet for so many years they were mainly men. You know, I remember Hemingway talking about being the champion heavyweight, and then Mailer said, I took the crown, I'm the champion heavyweight now. I mean, and you love boxing, and so now here you are, one of the champion heavyweights, right?
Oh, well, that's very sweet. But
It's just true.
I think the men were being a little silly with talking about this. And Norman Mailer said in advertisements for myself, well, I went like 1 round with Tolstoy, or 2 rounds with Hemingway, or I knocked out Turgenev or something. And I think he must have been so drunk when he wrote it. This is complete boy nonsense. I mean, how many rounds would you go with Emily Dickinson? Norman Mailer, one of the nice things about Norman Mailer, who was actually a friend of mine, Norman was not afraid to make a fool of himself.
Yeah, sure.
And he did it many, many times. And I think to be married to Norman, you'd be sort of wincing and cringing and, like, oh, what's Norman doing now? But there was something wonderful about Norman, and there probably isn't anybody like that anymore.
Well, Germaine Greer said that there was a kind of boyish sweetness that she understood. And today I happened to ironically interview Oliver Stone, and I thought I was going to get someone on the air who would remind me a lot of Mailer. In fact, I thought that Platoon was kind of the film version of The Naked and the Dead.
That's a
in many
great
ways.
movie.
I told him that that was at least my perception. He liked that, but all that kind of combativeness and bluster and everything, I found what I found in Mailer. He's actually kind of a gracious, sweet guy. I had to go after him because he had made some pretty serious anti-Semitic remarks, but it was for the most part notwithstanding that tenseness, a pleasant conversation.
Well,
And Mailer was always pleasant.
Well, it depends on when you met these people. If we met Norman Mailer when he was 30, or very belligerent, he's 40 and he's drinking. No, but I met him in the last decades of his life when he was really nice. He had one wife, Norris, who was with him at the end. But before that, the succession of all these different women, I wouldn't say that he was trying to be nice. He wasn't trying to, Mr. Nice, no more Mr. Nice Guy, whatever that thing. He wasn't trying to be that.
Actually, forgive me, Joyce, just the opposite. He once said to me, I don't want to be a nice Jewish boy. I want to be, in fact, I think what he wanted to be was a tough, brawling Irishman.
This is Norman.
Yeah, Mailer.
Oh, yeah. Well, he wanted to be Hemingway. He perceived Hemingway as the great American macho writer, and he wanted to be like Hemingway. And he conspired to be sent to the Pacific when he was in the Army in World War II. He got to go. He thought the Pacific would be the place where the great novel would come from. But we don't even look upon novels that way today. There isn't that kind of ambition. People don't set off to write a great American novel. If we look at somebody like David Foster Wallace, for instance, he's somebody who did a certain kind of very ironic homage almost to the mind being lost in a labyrinth. His sentences are very long and convoluted. Hemingway had a different zealousness and a macho integrity and forthrightness for all the negative qualities that macho that integrity moved forward and was not afraid. Whereas the ironic, labyrinthian David Foster Wallace kind of sensibility is very self-reflexive and doesn't really move anywhere, and it's caught in its own ingenuity.
Are you saying maybe a little bit what Joan Didion once said, that old-fashioned, in her essay, which was an homage to John Wayne, that there's something really attractive to women who come of age in America at a certain period of that machismo in men?
Well, it's the idea of moving forward. Ultimately, Hemingway committed suicide. The perfect man of action is the suicide, William Carlos Williams said. I'm trying to designate between two styles or two visions, that when Hemingway realized he couldn't be the man of action anymore, he was filled with self-judgment and self-loathing. He didn't like himself. He perceived that he was a very blighted and diseased person, that he removed himself. And both he and David Foster Wallace committed suicide. I mean, that's why I was sort of comparing the two. But one was coming from a certain kind of tradition where grace under pressure was the ideal, where you would behave in a heroic way. And when you could no longer do that, then you would remove yourself. Whereas David Foster Wallace is sort of post-heroism, a post-modernism, where nobody can really define anything. And it's basically this convoluted, self-referential hell. And some people probably have read the New Yorker piece by Jonathan Franzen where he talks about his friend David Foster Wallace, who, when the two of them are sitting in somewhere, I suppose in California, there are hummingbirds, beautiful little hummingbirds flying around, and Jonathan Franzen is staring at them. They're so beautiful, and David Foster Wallace doesn't see them. Or he says, "Look, this hummingbird," and Wallace says, "Oh, sure." He's not interested. He wasn't able to connect to the beauty of the world.
it's a kind of crippling cerebrality almost in some
Yes,
ways.
yes, that's very
He
well
was
put. Yeah.
also, I mean, and Hemingway also had a father who committed suicide, which I think played no small role. We're going to give everybody an opportunity to bring in questions and comments that you may have for Joyce Carol Oates. But I wanted to add, and I'm hearing music here that's almost sounding pretty sacred or something. So you mentioned the word grace before, and what do you see as perhaps the grace that may have come out of the experience that you went through? Because it was so close to the marrow of suffering, and you were so close to really ending it all. Aside from the fact that you were able to survive it, is there anything that you can speak of in terms of grace or hope, for that matter, that came of?
Well, it's kind of complicated. I think that the great sorrow and the great tragedy of all human experience is that we love some people very, very much, but we have to lose them, and we can't keep them, and they can't keep us. And that's, just in a nutshell, that's sort of the human predicament. And
You had
it's
said once,
very
actually,
sad.
I'm kind of trying to, I was talked about us as dancing partners. I don't want to be leading too much, but you said in the book something about they reside in us, and that really I found really quite stirring.
Well, that's true, but it's not the same thing. Like we all miss our parents if we've lost our parents. There's nobody like your mother or your father, and even when they're alive, you may be exasperated with them sometimes. But after they pass away, all the exasperations that you have with these people become endearing. And you think, oh, if I could have that person back, I would be so happy to have all of the annoying habits, And it's so interesting because when people die, it's like everything becomes, the negative becomes the positive, and the habits and the little customs and annoying things, then they become very, very poignant and very touching. So I don't know what to say ultimately, except that as far as being a widow or widower is concerned, the person does reside within you, but the world keeps turning, and just as you have to sleep every night, and every dream that comes is a new dream, and you have meals you have to eat, and so it's like the world keeps moving, whether you're going with it or not, you are propelled with it. That's what I meant by being in the canoe. And you think that you're in control, but you're not. So I would have just sunk down into terrible depression. But my friends came over, particularly one woman friend. She didn't say, Joyce, do you need any help? That's not what she said. She said, I'm coming over at 9 o'clock. I'll be ready at 9 o'clock and take you to probate court. That's what she said. And she came over, and she looked through the will and the papers and documents and the death certificate, because she was a lawyer, and she just did this. And then another person would come over, and 2 other people would come over and do things for me. And I just felt that I was so much in the hand of these nice people, and that whatever opinions one has about life or death is sort of irrelevant in the face of the existential and dramatic reality in which we're caught up.
And was it Ann Tyler who said to you, all that suffering, Ray was worth it?
Gail Godwin said that.
Oh, it was Gail Godwin, I'm sorry.
Gail
Yeah.
Godwin said, suffer, Joyce, Ray was worth it.
Yeah. Okay. On that note, we'll go to the audience. Please don't feel any inhibition. If you'd like to ask a question or join the conversation, just raise your hand.
And we'll have someone move through the audience, and as the back doors are open, if there are any people in the view room that would like to step in and ask a question, please do so. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dawa Dorji. He's going to walk among you and give you this handheld microphone so that you can ask questions of Mr. Krasny or, of course, Ms. Joyce Carol Oates. Dawa?
At what point in your life did you recognize that you were a truly exceptional writer?
I'm not sure that I ever recognized that. What a question. Wow. I'd never even thought that I would be a writer. I did a lot of writing. You could call it scribbling when I was a little girl. And I did a lot of coloring with Crayolas. And then it got to be like high school, and I would write a novel. And then it got to college, I'd be writing a novel. I never really thought that I would be a writer. I thought that I would be a teacher, and I have been a teacher. So I sort of trained to be a teacher, and I have great love and respect for universities and situations of learning. And I feel very comfortable and happy when in a classroom, you know. And I think that as a teacher, I'm very dedicated. But as a writer, you know, writing is so precarious, and you never really feel that, like the next morning, you might not be able to write or something. So I'd say the one is very nebulous and like a question mark, but the teaching is much more specific.
I was curious about your saying that the great American novelist can no longer come to fruition. In the early 20th century, there was a novel, you probably know it, Raintree County, written by Ross Lockridge Jr.
Yes, 1950.
And he aspired to be the great American novelist. Did he have a chance to be the great novelist then, or was it no longer the case? It was no longer New England, but the Midwest. In other words, is it a genre anymore, or is it not a genre?
It's hard to answer that question because it's sort of it's kind of an unreal question. You know, like the great American novelist was always perceived to be a man, and he would be someone who took on all these subjects. But it was all vanity and blindness because these people didn't have the right to be writing about women. I mean, they weren't writing about somebody in southern Arizona or northern Washington. It was always usually in the New York area or maybe Chicago. And Raintree County is not a novel that's read anymore. I did once read it, though. I read it a long time ago. It's very much based on Ulysses.
I know your novels are like your children, but admittedly, we do have some favorites among our children. And I would like to know, what are some of your favorites among your own writings, and why are they your favorites?
Well, one of the novels that's very close to my heart is called The Gravedigger's Daughter, because it's pretty much about my grandmother, my German Jewish grandmother, whom we never knew was Jewish. And after she died, some years after she died, a biographer was writing about me, did some research, and he discovered in court records, and he interviewed some people, that basically my grandmother had pretended to be some sort of Christian or Protestant, I'm not sure what she was, but in fact she was Jewish, and that was stunning. I was still stunned when I think about it, and it was sort of amazing. And so I wrote a novel about her. Most of it was imagined because, of course, I didn't know her early life at all. We all think that our grandparents only existed when we came along, you know. The idea that a grandmother was once 17 years old or got married or fell in love, that's very hard for a grandchild to conceive of. So I forced myself to think about that, and that's very close to my heart. And then also Little Bird of Heaven, which I wrote after, I rewrote the whole manuscript after Ray died. So that novel's saturated with grief and with loss and mourning, but I also made it, I thought, more beautiful and put a love of life in and some of the things that Ray loved. And describing things like birds and a cardinal in a tree wasn't in the first version. I just added things as if Ray's spirit was sort of helping me see things in a different way. And then another novel called Missing Mom, which is very much about my own mother. And that novel is pervaded with my mother's spirit and the things that she would see. I felt that after my mother died, about 2003, I think it was, I sort of felt that she was sitting in a corner of my study, and she was such a nice person. She was not at all intellectual. She was very rarely critical. She was very, very supportive and very emotionally supportive person. You know, when you take in a person whom you've lost to a certain personality, if you're a writer, you can then write sort of with that person helping you, or you see things a little differently. So the novel Missing Mom is about a girl in the novel whose mother dies, and she sort of takes the mother into her and becomes a better person. And whatever I have my mother in my mind, I'm a better person. Unfortunately, she's not there all the time.
Are you saying you're a little bit of a medium sometimes, or you feel like a medium?
Well, I'm not sure what medium means. Do we know what a medium is?
Well, I'm thinking writers like Alice Walker and Isabel Allende and even Amy Tan who say that sometimes they feel they're communing with something
Spirits.
beyond them. Their mothers are inhabiting them, or their
I know, they
ancestors.
think that. Well, we could have a discussion, we could have a symposium on what that means. A long time ago, like about 100 years ago, in this country, there was a bestseller, and it was supposedly written by a ghost. A woman had channeled a spirit, and she wrote this novel. I don't remember. I don't know the name of it, and I don't know the woman's name either. But this was on bestseller list, and I think it won a prize. And I'm not sure how you give a prize to a spook, But I'm not sure that would happen today. People would say, reviewers treated it pretty seriously, because belief in seances and spiritualists and, as you say, mediums, and what's the plural of mediums?
I assume media. It's like
Mediums, right?
Shelley Berman used to say, "A steward is steward eye."
Yeah. We don't have that kind of wholesale belief in that anymore. That seems like a lot of hokum to some of us. So we'd say, well, this woman who channeled the spirit in, say, 1910 or whatever it was, she was writing that novel. She may have thought that she was channeling a spirit, or she may have sort of pretended that she was channeling a spirit, because then she got her novel published and maybe it wouldn't have been published. Now, I have to doubt, I'm a little bit of a skeptic. When people say they're channeling a spirit, I would like to know a little more about that. In some cases, the spirits speak English, and they seem to know the same things that the people know. And there's something a little bit suspect about it. Now, if the spirit knows a language and knows things that the medium wouldn't know, then I would think it was some sort of a con game, actually. No, I'm pretty much a skeptic. But I like Amy Tan, and I like Isabel Allende and Alice Walker. They're wonderful writers.
Every time I teach a writing class, I quote your definition of a writing block. And I wondered, did you ever have one?
What was that?
Well, Joyce Carol Oates said that a writing block is a
Oh,
temporary
writing block.
paralysis of the imagination that believes on an unconscious level that what the writer is attempting is mistaken, self-destructive, or fraudulent. Is that
Yeah.
you?
Well, I was talking about writer's block. Yes, I think that I'm not sure everybody heard the question. Yes, I think writer's block, you're trying to do something too soon. You're not ready, you haven't done the preparation, or it's not honest, or it's not right, and on a deeper level, it's not quite the right thing. But if everything is aligned, and you've done enough preparation, taken notes and done research, and you understand that it's worthwhile, then you can write. That's what I think, yes.
Prompts me to ask you, just if I may, Edna O'Brien once said that most writers, she believes, struggle with whether or not, after they finish the work, the creativity, I'm talking about fiction writing now mainly, or poetry, drama, that the creativity will surface again, that it will be there. And that writers, she felt, were often fighting the sense of that possibly thwarting them, or that muse not being there, or whatever you want to call it. And with you, there's always been this amazing output of work. Has there been that sense in you, though, that maybe it's not going to come?
No, I think it's sort of like dreaming. We always fall asleep, we dream. Sometimes you don't remember your dreams or the disturbing dreams. Sometimes it's a very beautiful dream. Again, it comes sort of unwilled, but there's always some dream. And anyone can write really anything if you think of someone to whom you're writing, like you write a letter. You write an email letter to somebody, and you write about something, that the process is not ever going to fail you. Now, what you're writing about may or may not be profound, it may be trivial, it may be funny, it may be sad. That's a different question, but I think the process is always a reliable process.
find the time to have such a vast output?
Well, I don't know how I wrote all those books, and when Randy Souther was mentioning that I wrote 150 books, I was just sort of stunned. I don't remember. I mean, I have so much trouble writing one page. I actually write pages over and over again, and I don't actually know. I'm sort of stymied. I don't understand. I do work for a long period of time, and I used to be able to write like 10, 12 hours a day. I don't seem to be able to write that long anymore for one reason or another. But even so, I don't understand how I did it. So I'm not the best person to ask about that. I can't actually comprehend it because it takes a long time for me to write one page, and I seem to be just doing a lot of revision, and like my wheels are spinning. And then the next morning, I rewrite everything I did the day before often, and then I go a little bit backward, then I go a little bit forward, then sort of to the side, and so I'm not sure how to answer that. That's a great question, however. There's a gentleman here. Okay.
So to follow up on that question a little bit, how do you actually, teaching is so different than writing. How do you manage the two, or does one ever interfere with the other?
No, teaching and writing, I think, are antithetical. Teaching is social, and you're very involved in a community. You have the community and the communality of the students. You have a text. You maybe reverently are reading a text, and I go over lines, and if I'm teaching Hemingway, I might spend an hour on a short story by Hemingway, every line. And there is nothing in life that's quite like that, where you have people in a group, maybe in a circle around a table, and you're looking at a work of art, a poem, or a perfect short story, and that's wonderful. And nobody in the room basically can do that without everybody else. It's sort of a communal experience. I would not be doing it without my students. And the students are different every semester. They ask different questions, so it's always different. And then as I come in and I'm the professor, it's my responsibility to behave in the professorial way. So if my life is all in a shambles back at the house and I'm very depressed and anxious, when I come in the room to be the professor, I take on the mantle of the professor. I'm the adult in the room, and I forget all about my private life, and I look at the students and deal with their work for the day. And it's sort of like a little oasis. I think it's like a sacred mission, and I love it and take it very seriously. And so I have my colleagues, and we're in a department in a university, and it's all very respectful, and I have great admiration for it. However, now, back home, in the writer's life is like chaos, and it's very different. I was speaking of the wheels spinning. Many writers inhabit degrees of sense of failure and melancholy, and these are writers who are very famous, like Hemingway and Faulkner, and certainly Bill Styron, and even Norman Mailer, for all his bravado. I'm sure he felt many, many days of despair and unhappiness. His critical reputation was suffering. I'm sure Norman had all these dark feelings of self-doubt. I'm sure that he did. And that's the private life of being a writer, where you're kind of all in it alone and you don't really know what you're doing is good or not. Once in a while, when you finish a chapter or finish a work, you look through it and revise it, then you might feel that it was worthwhile. You feel good about it. But the daily experience of writing is not like that. You don't have a sense of the overall breadth of it. You're basically dealing with sentences and pages, and that's a very different and very finite vision. So the teaching and the writing are very different. Then as a teacher, you give your students ideas, and they execute them sometimes brilliantly, and they will run away and with their own ideas, and they do things. So you feel some pride for the students and happiness for them. I'm very proud of my students who've done very well. Whereas with my own work, I almost never feel proud I feel, oh, wow, I got that done. Oh, oh, I got that done. How'd that happen, Sort of a sense of relief that the whole thing didn't sink. So I'd say teaching and writing, to me, are completely antithetical, and they may have a little overlap, but basically they're very different.
Interesting. Cynthia Ozick talks about that in terms of the writer or artist and the citizen. I mean, and she says they're antithetical in the same way that you described teaching. And teaching is, I guess, being a citizen. It's that sacred
That's a
higher
good point.
calling.
That's a
Yeah.
good point. Well, some people think that artists are citizens, and they should be citizens. That's another point of view, that the artist is political.
But when you're writing, you're engaging maybe the more wild part of your imagination that you can't foster in your citizenship or in your classroom.
But Cynthia Ozick always writes from a certain political position. So you can recognize a Cynthia Ozick position. She may think it's wild and anarchic, but not really. I mean, she's got a pro-Israeli stance, let's say. She's not going to send bombs and nuclear weapons and destroy Israel. There's certain things that she would never do, even though she may think that. And in my writing, you're never going to see a cat or a dog injured. I'm being just a little facetious. I'm saying there are some things where you can say, oh, I've got this wild imagination, but there are some things that some people never will do in their writing because they just can't do it. They never would do it.
Oliver Stone said to me today, I have to keep my politics out of the drama that I create as a screenwriter or as a filmmaker, because you can lose the essence of the drama if you put too much of your homilies in there, or if you get
Yes.
didactic or that sort of thing. Do you feel that sometimes you're being drawn to want to perhaps be homiletic or didactic? Or?
No, I'm not like that at all. I'm really very contrarian. And while I wouldn't hurt a cat or a dog, I might seem to. Because there's one scene where it sort of seems that an animal's been hurt. I mean, I also feel that I'm the writer and I can do anything I want to do. And it's some Nabokovian. You're a Nabokovian, or you're Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair used his writing for social betterment, and he was a very serious communist, and he believed that art exists for the sake of society. Nabokov didn't believe that at all. But Nabokov is the better writer, and people read Nabokov, even though you hate his politics, but he's such a brilliant writer. And that's the test of a writer, is do you want to read him? And I'm sure people don't know that Upton Sinclair wrote like 90 novels, sort of trudging along and gamely pushing the socialist position, but nobody reads them.
This may sound a little like a fatuous question in some ways, but I'm prompted to ask you nonetheless, why, since you put so much work into it, I mean, when you're talking about the writing, I got rid of, why does literature and why do literature and writing mean so much to you?
Well, why does art mean so much to people? Generally, we've always had music. I mean, through history, in all cultures, music exists and some kind of art exists, even if it's only on cave walls. And people like Homer, obviously, were straining to write these great works. I think the question of why is very profound. I'm not sure that there's an answer to it. It's not a simple answer like, why do birds sing? We might think that we know why birds sing, or animals make certain noises to communicate certain messages. But artists, human artists, do things that are very, very exhausting and sometimes injurious to their health. Many people might not know that George Orwell, for instance, when he was finishing 1984, was on a very cold, in an island in a very cold situation. He had tuberculosis. He could have left that place where he was working and lived longer. But he chose to stay where he was and finish the novel, and he died soon afterward of tuberculosis. That's something that I think an animal, there's nothing, no analog, I think, in an animal world. That an artist like that will choose to shorten his life in the service of his art. And that's a question, that's a good question. It's a sense of a community. Orwell felt that 1984 was a very important novel. It had to be written, it had to be read by people. He had a sense of zeal and a messianic sense. So I'm not sure that I have the same kind of thing, but I feel sympathy and infatuation with personality and with different stories. And I'm working on now a novel that's about a family, and a girl in the family is engaged to a young man who comes back from the war in Iraq, and he's very changed. And now it's not an experience I've had myself. I haven't been to Iraq and I haven't been to war, but I can understand the family, coming, and this person coming back home. So I guess I feel that this is a story that's relevant and that has resonance right now, and that I'm sort of excited about it and writing about it. And then my next novel, which I wrote finally after I finished the memoir, is about a woman who's a university president. And there have been very few women university presidents of Ivy League universities until just the past decade. It was most unusual for a woman to be president of a large university until just recently. And I wrote about her. She has a collapse, and then she brings herself back together again. And I thought it was important to write about a woman, a high-profile woman in the academic world, who's a very good president, but she works too hard, and she doesn't know how to delegate authority, which you have to know if you're an executive. And she sort of has this collapse, but then she brings herself back together again. And I thought that was important for me to write about, to show that you can have a collapse and you can bring yourself back.
A good note for us to say, by way of concluding, that I'll use your word, I'll turn it into a verb. I think everybody here is grateful that you graced us with your presence here today, and we thank you for that, and we thank you for your extraordinary work. Great show.